On this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." Esther chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. Esther holds an interesting place in the Old Testament. It's a post-exilic narrative similar to Ezra and Nehemiah, but rather than focusing on the Jewish community returning to Jerusalem, it tells the story of some of the Jewish remnant in Susa, people who, for one reason or another, chose not to return to Jerusalem. And in many ways, Esther reads like a thriller. There's a nefarious plot. There's a clear bad guy. There's divine providence and bold actions culminating in a decisive moment for Esther herself and for the Jewish people. But at its heart, Esther is a very relatable story. There are no demonstrative miracles, just people making the choice to stand up for a cause important to them, and the God who is ever present, even if not specifically named. To help us navigate the book of Esther is Dr. Iain Duguid, professor of Old Testament at Westminster Theological Seminary and author of a commentary on Esther. My name is Jason Wieland, and this is Doable Discipleship, Navigating the Bible, Esther. All right, Dr. Iain Duguid, thank you. Did I do it right?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for joining us to help us navigate the book of Esther. I'm really looking forward to this. It'll be a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
So we start where we always start, because it's an important place to start, by starting with the basic details. So we're talking about the book of Esther today. So could you help us kind of set the stage a little bit? What do we know about who wrote this book, if anything, and do we know kind of when it was written? And I always like to kind of frame it up as, how does knowing the author or the date that it was written, how does that help us to read the book?
Right. So we really know nothing about who wrote the book of Esther.
That's typical for where we've been in the Old Testament.
It's often the case. Well, ultimately God wrote it. So
yes.
As long as we're clear on that, that's the main thing.
Yes.
We do have a bit more on the historical background. The Persian king, who's one of the main characters in the book of Esther, who in Hebrew is called Ahashverosh, which who we know through Greek transliteration as Ahasuerus, or from Greek sources as Xerxes, Xerxes the First, reigned from 486 to 465 BC. So it's important to, in understanding the book, to know where that is in Bible history, as much as it is in world history. So Israel and Judah have both been exiled from the land, Israel in 722 and Judah in 586. And then, so Judah went to Babylon, and then a number of those people returned in 539 BC and rebuilt the temple, 520 to 515 BC. So you have a lot of people who have gone back to the Promised Land. The book of Esther, however, takes place in Susa, one of the Persian capitals, and not in the Promised Land. And so you have two of the people who didn't return in Mordecai and Esther. And you ask yourself the question, why didn't they return when everybody else was going back? And the answer is that probably the economy. Going back was really hard. The land had been underpopulated for 50 years or so. Fields have been left untended, houses gone to ruin. And we see from books like Haggai and Zechariah, which talk about that those who did return, that life was really tough for them.
Yeah.
And so if you had a good job in the Persian Empire, as Mordecai did, there was plenty of incentive to stay where the action was and sort of keep your Jewishness undercover. And that's sort of the setting in which the book takes place. There's not an official policy of persecution of the Jews at that point, but generally they just tended to keep quiet about it. And it wasn't something that they were certainly prominent about.
Yeah, I think that's helpful for us, as you said, to put it in the context of what was going on in the Bible at the time, because we had Ezra and Nehemiah that we have talked through and read about, and so we see people starting to go back to Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the temple, they're rebuilding the walls, everything, and then it's like, but still going on over here. Right. So it's the story of what happened to, as you said, to the Jewish people who stayed.
Yeah, and a lot of people were left behind.
A lot of people were left. Either they hadn't made the movie or they chose to stay, as you said. That's right. So that's important to note, that this is what was happening over here. We have these things happening over in Jerusalem now, but now we have this still happening. Right. So I think that's helpful to keep that context for us in mind, because
but Jerusalem is still at this point under Persian oversight.
Yes.
So it's still part of the Persian Empire. So what happens in the Persian capitals can have huge impact on life in Judah.
Yeah. And for us, as we've been going through navigating the Bible, and as we're releasing these episodes, up next we'll have Job, and then Psalms, and then Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, so we're getting into wisdom. So this is going to stop our forward momentum of the story for a little bit of time, because then we're going to go back into the wisdom books, and we're going to, and that takes us kind of back into the writings of David and Solomon and whatnot. So Esther is going to be a little pause point after this as we follow the narrative of the Jewish people.
That's right.
So my favorite question to always ask is, how would you describe the book of Esther in one sentence?
Yeah, I think I'd say God takes care of his people and his promises, even when we can't see him at work.
God takes care of his people and his promises, even when we can't see them at work. That's as true as it is in Esther as it's true in our lives too. I think it's such a helpful reminder.
That's one of the connecting points with the book of Esther is the fact that much of the Old Testament perhaps feels a little foreign to us, because we don't see the Red Sea being parted in front of us.
Sure.
When we're late for an appointment, the traffic doesn't just kind of move aside. And we don't hear God thundering from Mount Sinai. At least I don't.
Yeah.
But the book of Esther is a book where you don't visibly see God at all. In fact, his name is not even mentioned in the book.
That's right.
But he's absolutely there, and the author wants you to see him, even when he's not front and center stage.
So let's talk then about the narrative flow of the book. The book isn't long; it's only 10 chapters, but a lot happens in those 10 chapters. There is a narrative flow. So help us walk through what happens in the book of Esther.
Right. So first of all, there's quite a long introduction before we even meet Mordecai and Esther, who from our perspective are the main characters. The story begins with a massive feast that King Ahasuerus has arranged. And at the height of that feast, which takes months, really, it's a months-long feast, he demands that his queen Vashti show up in front of him wearing her royal crown. The rabbis pointed out that it doesn't say that she's to wear anything else. I'm not sure if that's the right interpretation, but she takes it as being kind of demeaning for her to do that. And so she refuses, which puts everybody into a tizzy supposedly throughout the Persian Empire, although I'm not sure that most people really cared that much. It's kind of like the doings of the British royal family. Yeah. You read about it, but it really doesn't affect you much. But for the king, it's a big deal. So he's got rid of his queen, so he needs another queen. So there's this competition to find the most beautiful young woman to be the queen. Again, they're to collect women from all over the empire. but Esther gets included. And the fact that she's right on the doorstep there probably has a factor to play in that. You know, I'm guessing that not too many people were rounded up in Jerusalem and brought hundreds of miles to Susa.
Yeah.
But Esther and her uncle Mordecai are living right there right near the royal palace there, because Mordecai's got a job there in the civil service. And so Esther gets scooped up, which immediately makes you think about the comparisons and the contrast between Esther and Daniel and his friends, right? Daniel and his friends likewise picked up, in their case, by the Babylonians and taken to Babylon, where they're going to be inculcated with Babylonian culture and fed with Babylonian food. And you recall, of course, in Daniel 1, how Daniel and his friends say, no, we're not going to eat the king's food. Yeah. We're going to maintain our dependence upon God through this remarkable refusal of the royal food. And the Lord blesses that. And at the end of the testing period, they actually look better than the people who've been eating all the royal food. And in that context, better means fatter. I mean, one of the ways in which you display your wealth is by eating and by feeding up your servants. And so to get fatter on a diet of vegetables and water is remarkable, right? That's an act of God. Esther is quite different. You know, we're told that Daniel and his friends find favor with their overseers, which is part of God's promise all the way back in Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. But Esther wins favor. It actually uses a different Hebrew word there. She's working the system. And it's a system that's very familiar to us. Like, I mean, this is every reality contest that you can imagine, right? This is Persia's Got Talent rolled into, Survivor rolled into everything else. And Esther is working the system. You know, a key element of the story is that no one knows she's Jewish. Yeah. Now, if you're living in the royal harem, surrounded by other people constantly, there's no way that you can keep kosher food and keep the Sabbath and do all the things that go with being Jewish and no one know. So Esther's basically assimilated. And her very name, she has two names, right? Esther is her Persian name, right? Which comes from the goddess Ishtar. So it's a pagan name. But then she has a good Hebrew Jewish name, Hadassah, which means myrtle. But she goes by Esther. And then you have Mordecai, the Jew, right? He's the Jew, but his name, Mordecai, is after Marduk, the Babylonian god. And so they're people who have two different identities. They have their identity that blends them into the empire, where they're both working the system and benefiting from it. And then they have their Jewish identity as well, which is sort of on the back burner. Yeah. But anyway, so Esther, wins the contest, if you like, and becomes the number one queen. And the reader sort of feels not sure how to feel about that, right? I mean, on the one hand, good for her, she's doing well, but on the other hand, she's compromised, beyond what any faithful Jew should be doing. Yeah. And so you're not quite sure what to make of that at that point. Chapter 3 introduces us to Haman, who's the guy who's actually running the empire. And Haman is a descendant of Agag, who was one of the Amalekites, the Amalekite king in the days of Saul, when Saul was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites and didn't. So Haman has history here with the Jews. And when Mordecai doesn't bow down, when Haman goes by, then Haman comes up with a plot to annihilate all of the Jews in the empire. And it's very clear that the king, Ahasuerus, I mean, he doesn't make a decision in the whole book without somebody telling him what to do. Yeah. And he doesn't even ask who are these people you want to annihilate. He just signs. Says, okay. Signs the deal and say, let's go get a drink. And so at that point, the whole Jewish nation is in danger, right? I mean, he's given an edict to wipe out every single Jew off the face of the planet, which, of course, from our perspective, is a huge problem because Messiah is coming from that nation. So if we lose all of the Jewish nation, then we lose the Messiah. And so that's the larger backdrop there. And so Mordecai tells Esther that she needs to go and intercede with the king. And Esther says, but the king hasn't asked for me. And if I go before the king without being asked for, that's an automatic death penalty, unless the king says, no, it's okay, I'll let you off. And so Mordecai presses her and says, you've really got to do this. If you don't do this, he says, help will arise for the Jews from, and you expect him to say from God, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't. He says from another place. Yeah. Well, what is it? It has to be God. There's nobody else who's going to come and rescue them. So even there, he avoids mentioning God's name. But Esther says, okay, if I perish, I perish. I'll go ahead and do this. So she goes, and the king, allows her to live, having gone to meet him. But then she's got the problem that the king is the one who signed this edict. Yeah. Right. So how does she turn the edict around without, telling the king, you've been an idiot here, which is not going to go well in Persia. And so she has this idea. Okay, let me invite the king and Haman to a banquet, and we'll see what happens there. And so she invites the king and Haman to a banquet, and then then Mordecai disregards Haman again. Yeah. And Haman decides, okay, so I'm not going to wait for the whole edict to work its way out for the Jews. I'm going to string Mordecai up tomorrow. So the clock is ticking, and Mordecai doesn't even know that there's a bounty on his head. So that the people are out there building the gallows 70 feet tall to impale Mordecai on. And the clock is ticking, and nobody even knows there's a problem here. So you think, how is this ever going to be resolved? Well, the turning point in the entire story, and the book is a chiasm, so it's very clear what the turning point is. The turning point in the entire story is the beginning of chapter 6. Yeah. Now, what happens at the beginning of chapter 6? Well, nothing happens, right? The king has a sleepless night. That's it. And from there on, the whole story has turned on its head. Because what do you do when you're the king of Persia and you have a sleepless night? Well, the answer is whatever you want. You want your favorite boy band to come in. You want the Kansas City Chiefs to come and play an exhibition game. Whatever you want. And he chooses in his sleepless night to have a reading of the royal annals. Now, I've read some of those royal annals, and they're not the most exciting reading. And maybe that's the point. Maybe he's thinking, this for sure will put me to sleep, if nothing else will. And it just so happens that the part that they read refers back to an earlier incident when Mordecai had uncovered a plot against the king and reported it. And so the king's life was saved. And so the king starts thinking, well, how did we reward Mordecai for that? And the answer is, we haven't. Yeah. Now, that's very unusual. The Persian kings kept records of their benefactors and were very careful to reward people. If people uncover a plot against your life, it's in your interest to make sure that other people think, I wish I was that guy. Yeah. But nothing has been done. And so then Haman comes in, about to ask permission to string Mordecai up. And the king asks Haman, what should I do for the man the king delights to honor? Of course, Haman thinks, well, that's me. It's got to be me. Yeah. And so he describes his perfect day, which is to wear the king's clothes, ride on the king's horse, be the king in a sense. Now, if I'm the king, I'm thinking, do I really want my number one to be fantasizing about taking over from me? But in the end, he has to do all of those things for Mordecai. Yeah. And so he has to lead Mordecai through the city on their royal horse, riding the king, wearing the king's clothes, and Haman has to shout out, "This is what happens to the king, the man the king delights to honor," which of course is humiliating for Haman. Probably not that much fun for Mordecai, right? I mean, it's not his perfect day. But again, from then on, it's evident that Haman's star is waning, and so he goes home and he's humiliated. But immediately he has to go to another feast with Esther and the king. And at that feast, Esther accuses Haman of being the enemy who's trying to kill not only the Jews, but Esther herself, which means that she's outed herself. So now if the king doesn't come in on her side, then Esther has nowhere to hide now.
Yeah.
So that's a bold move. And the king doesn't immediately know what to do because nobody's told him what to do. And so the king goes out into the garden to try to cool down a bit. And Haman falls down before Esther and begs for mercy. And then the king comes back in, and now he's got an excuse to bump off Haman because, hey, he's attacking my queen. Yeah. Which he obviously wasn't. But he doesn't need, he doesn't need the facts, right?
Yeah, he's told something, he's going to go do it.
Yeah. So Haman is executed at that point. But we still have that edict, right? This is the law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be changed. Yeah. And so how do you do that without telling the king he needs to change an edict when that's the one thing he doesn't do? So she persuades the king to issue a counter edict that allows the Jews to defend themselves. Yeah. And so we have these dueling edicts for the same day. And of course, by that point, it becomes evident to the authorities which side the king is on now. And so the Jews are able not only to defend themselves, but to wreak vengeance on their enemies, those who were trying to kill them. And then they celebrate a feast called the Feast of Purim, which is a day to celebrate the turning of darkness into light, of sadness into joy. And that's to be a lasting festival for them. Every year they're to remember this. Now, again, there's no mention of God here. Yeah. But how do you celebrate going from darkness to light, from sadness to joy, through this remarkable turn of events, and not think about God? The whole point is he's there, right? Even when he's not there. And then the last chapter, it's only 3 verses, right? Short one, yeah. Yeah, we miss it. The story ends up with Mordecai as second in command of the empire. Mm-hmm. And there's a remission of taxes, which is always a nice thing. But it's a bit of a whimper as a damp squib as an ending. Sure. But that's the point, right? So much has changed, right? God's people were under threat of extermination, and God has saved them. And now, in place of Haman, we have Mordecai. But the guy at the top is still the same. Yeah. The guy who was quite happy to condemn the entire nation to death, he's still in charge. Mordecai's only second in command, and Mordecai's going to die at some point. And you're left in the same way as that Ezra and Nehemiah is left on this downer note. You're left on a downer note here, and realizing that, it's great that God has rescued his people, but we need something more than this. If all of God's promises of through Abraham of being a blessing to all nations, and all the way back in Genesis 3:15 of the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent, we need something more. The Old Testament is always a bit of an unfinished symphony, and leaves you with this sense that this is not enough.
Well, and like we said, this is a stopping point in the narrative account. Right. If you're reading through the Old Testament from front to back, and so as you said, you're kind of left at this little, okay, so it's Mordecai, great, he's second in command, but Xerxes is still there, an edict is still out to get rid of all the Jews. The Jews can fight back. But this edict is still out there. Things are still separated. There's still a bunch of Jews that are living out, not in Jerusalem. There's still this kind of, it's left kind of incomplete is what it feels like. And then you go right back into Job and then right into the Psalms and whatnot. So it is an interesting way to we're going to take a pause on this narrative right now.
Right. And that's true in the Jewish ordering of the books as well, where you end with First and Second Chronicles, which recaps the whole story, but ends just with the Jews returning from exile.
That's right.
And that's not really an ending. Or if you end it with Malachi, as we do, you're left still looking for somebody like Elijah, wearing a leather coat and a living out in the wilderness,
That's right.
and calling down fire on people. It's all set up to take you to the New Testament.
It's all just, it's there. It's waiting for you. It's waiting for you.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot in good conscience continue this interview without noting that you are in Philadelphia right now, and you mentioned the Kansas City Chiefs as the potential exhibition game. I am shocked that you did not say the Philadelphia Eagles after their complete victory over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. But I did want to point that out.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about a wider audience out there.
That's fair. That's a fair point. So you painted for us this beautiful picture walking through the book of Esther. So let's talk about some of these major themes that show up in the book. So what are a couple of these major themes that are worth pointing out? And then how does seeing them or knowing them in advance kind of help you read the book a little differently?
Right. So we talked about the fact that God's name is not mentioned throughout the book.
Yeah.
And so some people think it's a secular book, which I can't fathom, really. Yeah. The structure of the book, it so centers around all these coincidences.
Yeah.
Putting air quotes around them, that you're certainly meant to fill in the gaps there, right? And Mordecai and Esther themselves, that they're dual identities, which are challenging. How do you live as somebody who's faithful to the Lord and live in a pagan empire? That's something that we have some familiarity with. And Daniel gives you one model of that, which is a very positive model, right? As you look at Daniel and his three friends, you think, wow, those are heroes.
Yeah, they say, just own it. Yeah.
Yeah. But part of the challenge with that is, but often we're not heroes.
Yeah.
So we don't, we ought to identify with them, but they maybe seem a little hard to identify with. Whereas Esther and Mordecai show us God's providence working through people who aren't those, great heroes, who perhaps have even compromised in the past and feel like, who could easily feel like, we're on God's plan B or C or D or, triple Z probably. Yeah. We've made some wrong decisions in the past. Can God still use us? Esther, Mordecai, I believe they should have gone back home.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have been there, but there they were, and God chose to use people who'd made sinful decisions and done sinful things and still use them to step forward and have a critical part to play in his plan. It's amazing to think that God can even use our sin to accomplish his purposes. Now, it doesn't excuse our sin. Our sin is wrong, and we shouldn't do that. But it's also comforting to think that, and we all have a history. We've all failed God, and sometimes, sometimes we fail God in significant ways that are life-shaping decisions. And this book shows us that, even those life-shaping decisions doesn't mean that we're off the playing field. We're benched. No, God still perhaps has important things to do through us, ways in which he's going to work out his providence through us. Yeah. In spite of the decisions we've made in the past.
Yeah. I love thinking about the theme of identity in Esther. We already talked about how they had these different names, right? And we're going by their Persian names, Esther and Mordecai, even a little bit, and we have this theme of them, especially with Esther, being completely willing and ready to not talk about her Jewishness, not bring it up. But it's only when the tension comes in around, hey, all of my people are going to be, killed or affected by this edict if I don't say something. So it's like, it puts that before us, like, when the heat turns up, what are you going to do? Are you going to like which identity, in this case of Esther, are you going to side with? Are you going to stand with your Jewish identity, your Jewish roots, this heritage that you have, or are you going to kind of stay off to the side? And you have Mordecai encouraging her, saying, Esther, we need you. Like this is this might be why you're in this place. And again, not mentioning God, but you could say this might be why God has you where you are right now.
That way. Absolutely, yeah.
And then there's this other theme of boldness too, having that bold faith to be able to step in front of the king and enter into his court uninvited. You know, that's that question of like when a situation comes up, you know, you ask the question of, am I going to be able to step in faith to be able to step in front of what is wrong rather than kind of hide off to the side and let things happen. And so I love this book because it has these core themes in it. I have a special kindredness to this book. I was in a musical about Esther when I was 6 years old. So it has a special place in my heart.
There's a Hollywood movie about called One Night with the King.
That's right.
And what's really interesting is that they play with the chronology of the book in order to make Esther the heroine.
Oh, sure.
So the centerpiece is her pushing back these big doors and going in to see the king.
Of course.
But the way the book is set up, you know, as I said, in actual reality, that's not the turning point. That's the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5. But the fortunes of the Jews continue to go downhill in chapter 5.
Yeah, things keep getting worse, and then Mordecai speaks into the
night of the king, which Esther has nothing to do with.
Yeah,
that constantly around. So, which is beautiful because it puts together those two things, right? Mm-hmm. It's human responsibility together with God's sovereignty. So you are called to do what you need to do.
Yeah,
you know, to stand up like Esther. But at the end of the day, that's not the turning point.
Yeah.
The turning point is what God is up to. And God is able to use very flawed people. He's able to use strange circumstances that you couldn't have anticipated, what people might call coincidences. He's going to work all those things together for good, for the sake of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. So in a book that doesn't mention God by name, what does this book teach us about God?
Yeah, I think as I hinted at earlier, you know, we often think about God showing up in dramatic ways.
Yeah.
And you know, people are eager to have some kind of miraculous encounter with God, and feel like, you know, God isn't there unless they see that. And yet, for most of us, you know, we won't see those kinds of miracles.
Yeah.
You know, most of our lives, you know, we don't see dramatic interventions by God. You know, every now and then, maybe some things will work together, and we say, "Oh, I wonder if God is behind that."
Yeah.
But those things typically come to us in the same way that they come to Esther and Mordecai. They come through these hidden works of God.
Yeah.
You know, there was a professor, I think at Princeton a number of years ago, who encountered a man who came to us and said, you know, I have to tell you what happened to me. I was driving over here on you know, my horse and cart, and a runaway cart came heading straight towards me, and at the last minute it veered out to the right side, and I am convinced that, you know, an angel pushed it out of my way, and I'm so thankful to God that He has saved my life on this trip. And the professor said, "That's wonderful, but you know, I'm also thankful for God that I've made that same trip, you know, hundreds of times, and I've never had a horse coming out of control towards me. That's God's angels at work too." You know, and we tend to forget that. Yeah, you know, we tend to take for granted all of the ways in which God's providence is you know, keeping the drunk driver two streets away from us. Yeah, and keeping you know, tragedy at bay in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, and Esther, God's hand is almost more of His providence that we're just seeing. Like the fact that Esther and Mordecai stayed, you know, and didn't go to Jerusalem. If they hadn't stayed, who knows if that part would have happened, that edict still could have happened. Although, you know, Haman may not have gotten upset at Mordecai, and the whole situation may have never happened.
Right.
But still, like, it still could have happened.
All of these things, it's got at work in all of these things.
Exactly right. It's just a different kind of look at God's hand in things, which is great. So what does then Esther teach us about people, about ourselves?
Right. Yeah. We tend to read the Old Testament looking for heroes.
Sure.
People to want to be like. And Esther and Mordecai are kind of mixed. Like so many of the Old Testament saints, right? I mean, Abraham has these high moments and these low moments, and Jacob, and so God can use people, who don't have a squeaky clean resume. We tend to think, well, God would only, we can see why God would use Daniel, right? Because he's amazing. And his three friends, even though we call them the wrong names, right? We call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are their pagan names.
Yeah.
Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. They got wonderful, God-fearing names, and we, our kids grow up learning
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's right.
Yeah. Those are great models for us, but often they feel very distant from us. Whereas Esther and Mordecai show us that God can work through compromised people, and that even if you are a hero, you're not the hero, right? So Esther is important, hugely important in this story, but ultimately it's God who turns things around.
Yeah.
It's not ultimately thanks to Esther and Mordecai. It's ultimately thanks to God.
Now, I think we've touched on most of the people in this story, but I always want to offer, are there any people, either ones we talked about, it could be main characters like Mordecai or Esther, or it could be non-major characters that you want to highlight or specifically point something out about this person? Sure.
Haman. We don't normally think much about Haman because, when we have bad guys, we tend to say, well, okay, how am I not supposed to be like them? And most of us are thinking, well, I don't find myself tempted to commit genocide against an entire people group. So that doesn't really resonate with us.
Yeah.
But I think Haman makes an interesting counseling study. When he comes home after he's had this feast with the king and with Esther, and on the one hand, he's been on a high with that. And then he's cast down because on his way home from this banquet, he sees Mordecai not bowing to him, and that just ruins his whole day. It's fascinating as an insight that our strong emotions really reveal our hearts. On the one hand, he of all people is thrilled about the special banquet with the king and with Esther, right? Because he's all about respect, right? And that marks he's on his own there. He is the man the king delights to honor, Esther delights to honor, and he's flying high. And then all that it takes is for Mordecai not bowing to him, and he's just cast down. Yeah, and often we go for counseling in the latter situation, right? When we're feeling really bad about something, we should go for counseling in the first case too. When we're feeling too good about something, when our emotions are really overly positive, because something is driving us more than it does other people. And so both extreme positive emotions and extreme negative emotions are opportunities for us to search our hearts and say, Lord, what's going on here, right? I mean, yes, other people might be slightly ticked by it, but it wouldn't destroy them in the way that it destroyed Haman, or it wouldn't, other people might be excited about a feast with the king, but it wouldn't make them in the way that it made Haman. So anytime we should be searching our hearts anytime for these extreme positive and negative emotions, because they're very revealing of the idols of our hearts, what it is that we're putting in God's place. And so instead of God being the one whose favor lifts us up to the heights, something else is taking that place.
Well, that's what seems so clear with Haman. It's his hubris. It's this pride, right? Yeah. If he's so prideful that somebody who doesn't bow down to him it's like he's completely off kilter because of that. That's the pride issue. And then you see that hubris come back a little bit later.
Absolutely.
When Xerxes, or as the king is saying, what? how should I treat this person who I want to honor above all else? And he's like, hey, obviously it's me. So, and she just creates this pride, and then it's not. And so you can see the issues of pride just coming and ultimately getting the better of Haman in this case, for sure. So I love that encouragement to really search our hearts for what may be, changing our perspective or refocusing us away from God, away from these things. And if we're allowing people to knock us off kilter, like, hey, if we're focused on this pride with me, then you're not seeing God's hand at work. And Haman could not see God's hand at work.
Yeah, we want to be the man that the king on a human level delights to honor, instead of being the man that the king on the divine level that God delights to honor. That's what should float our hearts.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. So we like to talk about sticky parts in the book, parts that are maybe hard to understand, maybe confusing, hard to read. I know one of the major sticky parts we've talked about a bunch, which is the idea of God not being mentioned. That's kind of a sticky part as people kind of wrestle with what does that mean in the book. And I think we've done a good job of talking about, like, that's okay. God is still there. He doesn't have to be mentioned by name to see him there. Are there any other sticky parts about Esther that are worth talking about?
Well, there's a lot of people get killed.
Oh, sure.
And that, that shows up in a number of places in the Old Testament. And it's helpful to connect that with, the 1 Samuel 15, Saul's attack on the Amalekites. That's part of the judgment upon them for their assault on the Jewish people when they were coming out of Egypt. Those who oppose God's people face judgment. And there are a number of typological judgments in the Old Testament, the kind of foreshadowings of the last day. That on the last day, there is a day coming when God will judge all people. And you have foreshadowings of that in Sodom and Gomorrah. You have foreshadowings of that in the wiping out of the Canaanite population of Israel in order for God's people to dwell in the promised land. People struggle with that because they think of these as normal wars that are not being conducted in an ethical manner. But this was not Israel's normal pattern, right? Israel's wars under Solomon and David and throughout the historical period were not carried out this way. It's not as if that was just their general practice. This was specifically for these events that God had commanded that for. Well, here, part of protecting God's own people was a judgment upon their enemies, those who were about to wipe them out. And so it has this typological function of pointing forward to and showing that Genesis 12:2 and 3, God takes that seriously. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who despise you. And through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed, right? That's the promise back in Genesis 12:2 and 3. Here, those who try to destroy that promise, to destroy God's people, face the consequences. And that's a warning to people that God is serious about which side you're on in this battle. Whether you're on the side of Christ and submitted to Him and serving Him, or whether you're opposed to that. There are only two places to be ultimately, and so we have warning shots, as it were, fired across people's bow at certain points in Old Testament history to encourage them to take seriously the call of Psalm 2 to bow down before the Son and do Him homage now, find refuge in Him while there's still time, because there's a day coming when He's going to, crush His enemies like broken pieces of pottery.
Yeah, and it's also just not a pleasant visual picture to picture Haman being impaled on a 75-foot tall sharpened pole. So that's adding. He did want to put Mordecai on there.
Was for Mordecai. So.
Yes. So there is some righteous justice in there, but at the same time, not the best visual as you're reading through the book. Well, Iain, thank you so much for helping us to navigate this book of Esther. Thank you for walking us through it. As somebody who has spent so much time pouring into the Old Testament, and in this case, pouring into Esther, I always love ending by asking, what is something that you think everybody should know about Esther, but probably doesn't?
Yeah, we mentioned it earlier, and that's the anticlimactic ending. And people get as far as Purim, perhaps, but then they ignore the last few verses.
Sure.
Just as with Ezra and Nehemiah, which is one book originally.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to read Nehemiah 13, where everything is threatened. And it's what the theologians call partially realized eschatology.
Yeah.
Or the now and the not yet. We talk about that normally in terms of the New Testament. Christ has come, Christ has died, Christ has risen. Anyone who's in Christ is new creation, and yet we still find ourselves living in a fallen world with fallen bodies, struggling against the flesh. That we are already new people, and we're really thankful for the work the gospel has done in us and through us. But we're not yet what we shall be. We're still looking forward to something more. Well, I think particularly in this post-exilic period of the Old Testament, as you read Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, and as you read Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, there's this great sense of partially realized eschatology. The people have returned to God's lands. They've rebuilt their temple. They're worshiping God again there. God has been faithful to his promises. But this is not what Isaiah foretold. This is not what the prophets anticipated. There's this longing for God to finish what he's promised. And the end of the book of Esther just classically fits that pattern. It's the cry of God's people, how long, Lord? Yeah. Maranatha, come, Lord. Which we also as Christians can cry out. Yeah. We have more, much more than they did. But we can still cry out, come, Lord Jesus. We're still looking for what will only be realized at his return.
Well, Iain, would you mind wrapping us up by praying for people as they read the book of Esther? Maybe they've never read it before, and now they want to after hearing this, or maybe they've read it before, but it's been a while, and they want to reread it now with some new vigor. I would appreciate it if you would close us out in praying for these people.
Of course, let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this book, the book of Esther, and for what it teaches us about who you are and who we are, and your redemptive purposes that come to fruition through the coming of your Son. Lord, like those Old Testament saints, we too groan as we wait. We're still waiting for the fullness of new creation. And we pray that as we read the ways in which you protected your promises through your providence in the past, that would build in us a great trust that you will continue to protect us through your providence, and that everything you have promised in the past is yes and amen in Jesus Christ, and will certainly come to fruition. Help us to trust you, particularly in those times when life is hard and when we ourselves are struggling, and it seems you seem far away. We can't hear you, we can't see you, and so we're tempted to believe that you're not at work. Remind us, Lord, that you can be at work when nobody can see you, and that work will reach its purpose. You will work all things together for good for those who love you and who are called according to your purpose, just as you promised in the book of Romans. And we thank you for that encouragement in Jesus' name. Amen.